Welcome to Diabreadic, a podcast where a T1D artist and a T1D expert come together to bake some bread, and then we break bread with smart and interesting people as we talk through the human in health and technology. I'm Stephen Horrocks, PhD and expert in experiences with diabetes and devices.
And I'm Melissa Horrocks. I am type 1 diabetic, artist, baker, creator of all things.
And in this episode, we're talking about Fougasse and exploring diabetes through art with Dr. Samuel Thulin.
All right, we're talking about Fougasse.
Fougasse.
The spelling is insane.
Insane.
I was like, Steve, how do you spell this?
It's just French.
I was trying to Google it. To look at pictures. If you've ever looked up pictures of Fougasse, it's most of the time kind of leaf looking or I don't know, slices.
Generally speaking.
Anyway.
Yeah, that's the classic, a kind of leaf shape. But Fougasse, which for those who want to search it right now, since you're listening, it's Fougasse. You're welcome, Melissa.
Okay, nobody would have guessed that.
Listen, it's just French spelling, right? So it's cool.
Even for French spelling, it's weird.
Well, either way, Fougasse is a French bread, given what we're just talking about and its name. But the thing that usually sets this apart and makes it identifiable is its shape. The nice thing about Fougasse, though, is that you can use, generally speaking, a pretty standard dough. And in fact, that's usually what we do. We have our kind of basic white bread dough, and more often than not, when we make Fougasse, this is the recipe that we use, which is a little note that I actually picked up from our old Richard Bertinet, who he's amazing. But anyway, that's not what this is about. We will have to, honestly, we're gonna have to do an episode that talks about Bertinet because he's amazing. But
go look him up.
Yes. So we just used our regular white bread dough recipe that is up on the blog, and the difference here, though, is instead of slightly deflating and then rolling it up, shaping it as a loaf and putting it in a loaf pan or one of the other, like as rolls or whatever else, instead you divide it up usually into about 3 pieces, but it kind of depends on how much dough you make, and then kind of flatten them out with your fingertips on the table so you have a flat-ish piece of dough.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be perfect.
No, in fact, that's one
what's
of the
so
things,
great about it.
Yeah, because what I have found is that when we do this, when I cut the dough up into pieces, they're always different shapes. I can never have any uniformity in any of this stuff. But the nice thing is...
Which drives Steve crazy.
It kind of does.
It's like, who cares?
It kind of does. Okay. I don't know what it is. I guess I'm a little bit obsessive about the kind of aesthetics of the bread. But the nice thing is that because we are playing around with their shape a little bit, it doesn't really make a difference. So the idea here is you have this now flattened piece of dough, and you'll use some kind of tool to just cut through to the table so that you create these little kind of slits in the dough. There are a couple, like you mentioned, a couple of shapes that are pretty standard.
Yeah.
Right? Leaf shapes are super common, and we will have a couple of pictures on the Instagram post, and then also some things possibly in the blog. We'll see if we do a Fougasse post there too. But there are a couple of other things. You can kind of go wild with this a little bit.
I've seen a lot of different things.
Yeah.
People fill them, like fill the spaces with different things, or, sky's the limit, really.
Yeah, and so depending on what shape your little piece of dough is, as you're cutting these little slits into the dough, you kind of spread it with your fingers a little bit, so you open those up into holes. And so you get these networks of kind of skinny pieces of dough, and top it with whatever you feel like topping it with, and pop it in the oven You can put it on a sheet pan if that's what you have. If you have a stone or a baking steel or something like that, slide it in on that. It bakes pretty hot and pretty fast. And what comes out is basically this interconnected breadstick.
I was going to
almost.
say breadstick.
Yeah. And so they're super, they're really good to kind of tear apart and dip in things.
Yeah, they're really fun to eat. So
Yeah. And so, we played around with some toppings this time. I've never used a tar on a Fougasse, but we went with that this time. There's the classic, like salted with olive oil, sometimes with rosemary, something like that.
Parmesan. I mean,
Parm.
yeah,
Some
go
meats,
wild.
right? I've seen like salami.
Ooh,
With
that would have been good.
Yeah. Yeah, various veggies too. I've seen people using veg on top. Veg. Oh my. Anyway, one of the kind of keys here, and maybe this is a bread tip for this episode. Fougasse can be a little tricky to move around because you now have these really skinny, thin pieces of dough. And so if you tried to like pick it up with your hands, it would just stretch and be really hard to maneuver. If you have a peel, like a pizza peel, it'll be a huge, huge help with this. But there are two things that can be really helpful in being able to actually move and use this thing. First, you can just put it on parchment and then cut it and then spread it. And then you've got it on something. So you can just slide the parchment in. And that's really handy. But if you want to go wild a little bit and like try it out.
Steve.
This
is wild for Steve.
I'm so wild. Throw a little bit of semolina flour or cornmeal on your countertop, maybe with a little bit of all-purpose flour too, to kind of mix around. But that will act as little ball bearings. And so it will slide easier onto a peel or a baking sheet or whatever it is that you're sliding it onto. So
yeah, and it does bake a little different when you don't have the parchment in between. So there will be a little bit of difference.
For sure. You get that direct contact, and so you get a little more browning on the bottom if that's the case, which can be a good thing. It can also, maybe that's not what you want. Maybe you want it a little more uniformly browned.
Sure.
Top and bottom. And so parchment would be your best friend. So yeah, so check out our discussion of the Fougasse over on Instagram if you haven't yet, and go make this for yourself. All right, our guest today is Dr. Samuel Thulin. He is an artist, composer, sound designer, educator, and researcher who explores through art space and place, especially how the human and the technological come together within those contexts. And one of the kind of streams of that work has been exploring this human and technological interaction in the context of diabetes. And so much of our conversation will likely center around that. Samuel, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Steve. Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Of course. We like to start first off by asking this broader question. What is your relationship with bread, and what is your relationship with diabetes?
Yeah, so I'll start with bread, I guess. I love bread. I've been into bread from a very young age. Growing up, my father was always baking bread, and so all my kind of school lunches had sandwiches with my dad's bread. But I like all kinds of bread, really, and I mean, I was just as into store-bought sandwich bread, to be honest.
Yes.
But I enjoyed that, and I enjoyed like trying other breads when I would go to my grandparents' house. That was in Maine. I was growing up in New Brunswick in Canada, and so then there's different bread options in Maine, and now I live in Montreal, which is an amazing city to be into bread in, because there's
very much so.
Yeah, there's about 10 great bakeries, say within a 15-minute bike ride from where I live. And so it's pretty much
Wow.
like a weekend morning ritual to go out and get some fresh bread first thing in the morning. So yeah.
That's amazing. I'm quite jealous as someone who is in a fairly smaller city in the Midwest. We have one good bakery in town, and that does breads anyway, and they're only open 4 days a week, I think now. So it's a struggle, but that's great.
Yeah.
And it's funny because we often have a lot of conversations on here about homemade breads, understandably, given a lot of the theme. But we've also talked a little bit about how, like, I also have some pretty interesting memories, a lot of nostalgia around store-bought bread, especially store-bought white bread. I just have this like a childhood association with turkey with mayo on white bread. I don't know what it is, but it's
yeah. Well, that's it. That's a winning combo for sure. But it's also fun. It's kind of like this grass is always greener sort of thing. I mean, my brother and I were getting this amazing bread our dad was making, and I can remember sometime my brother like actually buying a loaf of white bread just because he wanted like that store-bought white bread. Like it was like a treat, you know.
Yes. Yeah, because it's for me at this point, I don't usually buy or eat that myself. So on those occasions it's kind of this that's funny to think of the kind of white bread as a treat. That's great.
Yeah.
So what then is your relationship with diabetes?
So I've been living with diabetes for nearly 20 years now.
Okay.
I was diagnosed just after I turned 18. I mean, I'm sure a lot of this will come out in our conversation, but I guess now what I would say is probably for the first 15 years or so of having diabetes, I approached it really as, obviously a huge part of my life, but it wasn't something that I kind of incorporated very much into other aspects of either my kind of professional or artistic life. And then around 5 years ago, that changed a bit, and I started to think of it more in terms of both the sort of academic work I was pursuing and the artwork that I was making. So there was a bit of a shift that's been more recent in my life.
That's interesting. And so you mentioned that you were 8 just after you turned 18. So
yes,
in adulthood then, right? So you'd spent
technically, yep.
Almost 2 decades then prior to diagnosis. And one of the things that I'm often kind of curious about and interested in hearing a little bit about is what that kind of shift was like at that time, because that's a pretty kind of significant moment in general, and a lot of things are moving and changing around that time. And so what was it like with this kind of diagnosis inserting itself in the mix there?
Yeah, it was pretty difficult. It was my first year at university, just before the Christmas kind of break. It was a lot to take in, and I think that it also precipitated some other health issues that meant that throughout my undergraduate degree, I really wasn't feeling great, and I think some of the time there was a bit of, there was definitely frustration there in terms of, this being this idealized time in
right.
As a kind of popular narrative that, these are the best years of your life and everything. And
right.
I was kind of feeling like crap a lot of the time. So that was a bit hard. And it was a bit, it was a very, just in terms of that initial diagnosis too, just that kind of the shock of receiving that diagnosis was difficult as well, and a kind of a real exercise in changing perspective, I guess, or adapting to another way of seeing my life.
Yeah, that language of adapting to, I think, is really interesting in the context of diagnosis, because that framing, the way it frames everything, right? It changes how everything is understood, the way we see and experience everything, and that juxtaposition you're talking through there with the popular narrative of the college years, your early 20s, or all that stuff as the best years of your life. You're young and you have so much energy and all this stuff. But also, on the other hand, recently diagnosed with diabetes, especially those early months and things through the honeymoon periods and all that, it's a wild ride, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. For sure.
So,
Yeah.
So one of the things that I have found really interesting, and I think for me intellectually stimulating about a lot of the work that I have seen of yours and the way that you talk into a lot of this work that you mentioned, that it's been about the last 5 years or so that you have started kind of thinking about that experience with diabetes and technologies in the context of your work. One of the sides of that I have been particularly drawn to is the way that you are bringing together this audio production and the production of visual art together, like using audio in producing art. How did you come to that space or that kind of collection of media in the process of your work? Because it's really fascinating.
Oh, yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I mean, I came to art definitely through music, so being attuned to sound in the first place, and kind of gradually, I guess, from music and being interested in recording my own music, branching out to recording other sounds and working with those sounds as material to create stuff that's not necessarily musical, some soundscape composition and some different forms of audio art or sound art. And then actually kind of thinking that in relation to other media and visuals has been an even more recent step for me, I would say. And maybe it's interesting when I think about it. I think that it's especially come out in the work that I've done with diabetic data, actually, that's some of those projects have been really where that's coming out a bit more, the sort of translation between different media that's going on when you work with something like data that can and that does kind of flow between different senses and understandings, or potentially it can.
Yeah, certainly. And that some of those projects, it is interesting to hear the way that that it was the work specifically around diabetes and all of that data that you use in the production of this work, that's the location that has started bringing together the audio and kind of visual or material productions all together there. And
No, I was just going to say, I like that you also brought in you hit on that materiality too, because that's something that really interests me. And I think in some ways it's that idea of materiality that ties the audio and the visual together. But yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, well, and this, that point actually kind of reminds me of one of your projects that I remember seeing and reading about, that had to do with the way that some of these blood glucose or CGM data are used to produce different visualizations through sonification, but then also, and this was a really interesting piece here, experiential work with kind of wearables that vibrate.
Yeah.
Right? And so tying together the material experience of those who are experiencing the art with the visual and the audio, how did you get to that place with the vibration? Because the vibration work, I think, is really interesting and also kind of central to how the visuals are produced, right?
It is. Yeah, it really is. Yeah. And thank you again for that. And I mean, that idea of working with vibration is really tied, in fact, to the sort of the beginning for me in thinking about making art with diabetes, because actually what happened was I began a postdoc where I was, one of my kind of main roles was to be a co-curator and coordinator of a deaf and disability arts exhibition where the focus was really on media arts and vibrotactile technology. So artists working with the idea of vibration and wearables and, you know, things like cushions. We created a vibrational floor for a work. So these different forms of vibration, thinking through accessibility in different ways and different sort of sense experiences and that sort of thing through vibration. And it was really not until I began doing that work kind of as this coordinator and curator that I started to reflect on my own experience as a diabetic as something, you know, that could be interesting to make art about and with. And we were collaborating with Vibra Fusion Lab, which is based out of London, Ontario. And so I was inspired to kind of, I'd explored a little bit with vibration and tactile transducers before and sound work. But now here I was I became interested in taking up that technology and that approach to think about my diabetic data and like to try and use that data to drive some kind of resonant or vibrational experience that played out in two ways really in that work, as you hit upon. So one part of it is the audience being able to sort of feel the data, if you will, through the vibrations that it produces. And then another part is kind of sending those vibrations through a material that is very prone to kind of amplifying the vibrations, and then laying out all my used test strips. So the blood test strips that sort of help to produce the data in the first place. Yeah. Then they're on this surface and the vibrations from the data sort of make them bounce around and animate them. So it's this stuff that's usually biomedical waste, right? That you throw out, and it's kind of given this different sort of life in this visual. So I videoed the sort of animation of those test strips as they were being vibrated by that data. So in the work you see that on a screen. You see those test strips and the sort of patterns that are being produced at the same time as you can feel the data as well.
The conceptualization of this piece as a whole is fantastic. This kind of multi-fronted experiential kind of process is really fascinating. And I had not in the kind of photos of the videos of, and so now I'm several points removed there, right? But in the photos, I hadn't actually noticed that those were the test strips that were being vibrated. Yeah. And that's fantastic. This idea of kind of cycling back through the process that created the numbers that were then being used to produce vibrations that were then vibrating the object that was used to produce the numbers in the first place, right? That cycle is really, really fascinating.
Yeah, thanks.
And I am struck by, and also not particularly surprised by, the fact that a lot of this kind of multi-sensory approach was framed around a kind of project or curatorial process specifically oriented toward disability and accessibility of the art and the production. That side of this conversation, I think, is really interesting and important. And you have an article, a chapter in the recently published Undoing Diabetes that, in part, is using the framework of disability to try and get at some of these questions about what it means to live with diabetes in some more complex ways and challenge some of our assumptions. So kind of reflecting back on that process, I guess, that may or may not have influenced a lot of the more current sonification work that you've also been doing in soundscapes and things like that. Are there any ways that you can kind of, how do you understand the way that your focus on accessibility there served as and or still serves as an important kind of operative factor in getting to where you are and how the work is getting produced at this point? Because that's like I said, a really interesting part of that story.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's a fantastic question, and I think a complex one. I think it operates on a few different levels, for sure. I mean, part of it is kind of baked into the concept of the work, in the sense of it being a sort of being a critique of the way that numbers are very often used, and the way that they orient bodies towards an idea of what's normal and what's not normal. And in terms of kind of the accessibility, it's interesting because definitely in the context of that exhibition, the idea was to think about accessibility from the beginning of creating the work through to the end, not thinking of it as an add-on, like after the fact, that here's the work and now let's make it accessible, but to think of accessibility as having aesthetics of its own as well. And I think that's something that I try to continue to explore in the work that I do. I wouldn't say that everything I make is 100% fully accessible.
Sure,
for sure. Just a note about that accessibility aspect as well. After the pandemic, I wanted to continue this work, but the idea of having an exhibition where people would come and touch objects and stuff, that wasn't really a possibility anymore.
Not really in the cards.
No. So that's when I started to rethink it a bit, and that's when I started to do some of the first online digital artwork that was still trying to explore the senses and sensorial experience, but to deliver it in an online setting. And although I'm particularly attuned to sound, I wanted it to be both accessible, through visuals and through sound, and so that's how that visual work has carried over in this, some of the new iterations of this exploration.
Yeah, and that gets toward some of the sonification projects that you have done related to the blood glucose data that I have found really interesting, because and I've seen a number of these that you have kind of up on your website, and we have these really fascinating visuals produced by the vibration of the audio that's being produced by the numbers, right? And then it's showing the number in that visual production as well. How did you get to that sonification part of this? And part of the reason I asked that, I guess it would be a little more foundational, I guess, is how has this process over these past few years that you've been engaging with your experience with diabetes and these devices that are producing all of these numbers, all this data, how has your work thus far been influencing the ways you understand what these numbers even are and what they mean, what they can be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. Where am I going to start? I mean, sonification, how I got to sonification, I guess I'd already explored it a little bit with some other types of data, with GPS data. Maybe it was the first thing. And then it was another project that wasn't about my bodily data, but actually someone else's that I first got into a bit more of the self-tracking stuff. And that was a collaborative project with an older choreographer who was wearing a Fitbit device and kind of reflecting on that experience of self-tracking and some of the ideals of self-optimization that it pushes you towards.
Right.
And thinking about also being in the milieu of dance. And so she created a choreography based on that. And I took the Fitbit data and created some, a sort of music or a soundtrack to go with it. And I think that was happening actually around the same time as that Deaf and Disability Arts exhibition. And so those two things together really were that impetus for working with my own diabetic data, specifically to look at the self-tracking data that I produce. And even in that work I mentioned earlier that was really vibration oriented, it began with sonification. The way that I produced those vibrations was first through a process of turning the data into sound that was later experienced as vibrations. And so I guess that the idea of sonification has kind of been at the core of these explorations for a while. Your other part of the question, I think, was around, how it makes me think of numbers, maybe, or kind of.
Yeah,
is that right?
Especially the way that those numbers, all of this data about your body, frankly, we are trained to understand what those are and what they mean, what we can do with them in very particular ways. And it's always around the context of treatment, right? Understandably, because that's the purpose of its creation initially. But how has your kind of playing with those things and ideas changed the way that we can think of the possibility of these kinds of numbers and data?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for highlighting that, Steve. That's a big part of what this project is to think about this data in other ways out of the biomedical context. And so for me, it like gives me a space to work with this data in which there's kind of a remove from that impulse of sort of judging the numbers, like typically, I still experience this on a daily basis. My numbers, when I see what my blood sugar is, I have some kind of reaction to it that's positive or negative. But when I'm kind of creating artworks with it, that kind of goes out the window a little bit, and there's a kind of reorientation to those numbers. And through working with them, and especially sonification is interesting because it's also time-based. And it's been interesting to me to reflect on how it forces me to think of some interesting questions around temporality in diabetes. Also, and context, for sure, context around these numbers that are often kind of abstracted away from the context that produced them and all these factors that are going into it. And then, how can I sort of bring some of that back into the data by making it material or making it sensorial?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that question or conversation about the temporality of diabetes and how treatments have changed that, right? Treatments are central in kind of framing that process is really, really interesting. One side of this work too, that I think speaks to some of that process that you are getting at in recontextualizing, right? And providing context, has to do with the way that you are, and have for a long time, used sound and other productions in creating soundscapes and using soundscapes then in other kind of larger experiential projects. And I know that you are currently doing some soundscape related work in the context of diabetes specifically. And so before kind of speaking to that project, I am curious how you understand or experience the diabetic soundscape itself. Like, what is your soundscape with in the context or in relation to diabetes?
Yeah, no, I mean, that is a fantastic question. And I've heard this come up on previous episodes of your show too, around like alarms and alerts and these kinds of things, which actually aren't a big part of my life because I don't use a pump and I don't use a CGM at the moment either. But I did, there are still a lot of sounds involved. And I did have a kind of, it wasn't a project that's really led anywhere yet, but for a while, for a few months, I made a point of just every time I would test my blood sugar, also making an audio recording at the same time. And so I have this series of recordings that are both kind of just the context, the sort of random place that I happen to be when I need to test my blood sugar. But also that's kind of keyed me into some of these sounds of kind of like the Lancet device and just these, even popping the canister of test strips open. Like, it's a super loud sound that I never even thought of, but it's like I'm
pop
doing that
and then
all
the snap
time.
when the lid goes back on,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the little shake that you can hear the test strips inside there.
Yeah.
Right? That's I love the idea of the way that the ambient sound is influential in the way that we can understand the actual active sound associated with the testing. Like you said, you pull back the little spring in the Lancet device, you hear those ka-dunks and all those little things that are part of the soundscape of the treatment. But that context is really fascinating because I am sure, and you could probably speak to this, I am sure that there are myriad actual spaces and contexts and public-private where you have to test in those moments.
Yep, exactly. And I mean, one of the downsides of this little experiment I did was that I decided to do it during the pandemic. And so I actually wasn't going out that much. It was pretty domestic, pretty private, but often I, it's when I'm active and doing something outside often that I test more. So normally that would have come through. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's also a good point. This is all happening in the context of the pandemic too. And so the soundscapes of diabetes are different right now for most people than they had been 2+ years ago, right?
Yeah.
And so that does pose some really interesting kind of questions in the large scale for us to think through there. One of the projects that I know that you mentioned you have been, there's a couple of kind of contemporary current projects that you have been working on right now. One that has to do with this kind of immersive installation that I think speaks to a lot of these themes that we are talking about. Can you speak a little bit to this project, Sweet Immersion?
Sure. Yeah. So this is a project that I'm doing in the context of an artist residency at the Society for Arts and Technology here in Montreal. And so they like to have artists come in and work with the technologies that they're developing. And so in my case, there's both a software and a hardware side of this, and they both have to do with audio spatialization. So they've created these, what they call audio dice, which are these kind of 12-sided die that are about the size of, I don't know, a basketball or something. And on each face of the dice, there's a speaker. So they have 5 of these. So it's actually like 60 channels of sound. So it's a really like interesting system. And these different die can be moved around in different configurations and that sort of thing. So the project that I pitched to them was to create a kind of immersive installation, sonic installation that is driven completely by diabetic data, by blood sugar data. And to think about here, I mentioned temporality before, and definitely that's part of this work, but also thinking here about spatiality and kind of playing with this idea of immersion, of the way, in some sense, the inside and outside of a body, say, but also how much, having diabetes is a kind of immersive experience in a lot of ways.
Right, for sure. And so that also kind of points us toward and connects back with one of the other conversations that you had opened up a few minutes ago around how, in the context of the pandemic, really, understanding what an immersive and experiential art project can be in that context gets really messy. And so doing that online can provide at least a way of getting out at that. And I know that you have a current project that you're working on in that front as well, right?
Yeah. So I have another project called Sensing Sugar. And that project is building on some of that earlier work that I did, as you mentioned, online in the context of the pandemic, but opening it up. And so I'm really excited about this because I've always worked just with my own diabetic data. And this project is kind of making it possible, or the goal is to make it possible for other diabetics, really anyone who tracks their blood glucose, I suppose, to use that data to create a sort of audio-visual experience online also. So that's a kind of overview of what Sensing Sugar is, or what it aims to be. There are some aspects of it that are challenges, I would say, or things I'm a little apprehensive about. But yeah.
Such as? Now I'm curious.
Yes. Such as, I'm really excited about making this work, but there's also part of me that's like, but is anyone going to engage with it? Like, is anyone going to be willing to do this? Because I understand, this is sensitive data, it's private data, and there are issues of trust and privacy. There's a lot of complex relationships to the data, which are really what I'm interested in. But I also understand that could be something that's difficult to move past for people contributing to the project. And I also, there's also just some technical barriers around all these different platforms and different ways of collecting data, different apps, different devices. And so how do I create a system that's going to be able to work with the data no matter what form it comes in, which is difficult.
Yeah, that is tricky. And that's made all the more tricky by the fact that with many of these, there's no way to get at that data unless you are using their proprietary online-based software that they have to submit to this company in order to see their own information. And so, there's a lot of those kind of data-specific complexities. And then also, like you said, that very practical issue of what happens when all of this that's collected looks different among these different platforms, and getting these to speak to each other gets really messy. In the in conceptualizing this project, because that's like the practical side of making it work, right? Conceptually, what does it do, or how does it change the way that you are thinking about, and or the way that it would cause us to think about the numbers, the data, and or bodies, etc., when it becomes a collaborative piece? Because collaborative work requires a different kind of connection with the work, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and I'm still thinking through these things as I work on it. But I think for sure, for me, it's part of my interest in kind of trying to see the different ways or the different perspectives that can emerge from approaching data as something other than just kind of purely designed for management and kind of treatment of the disease. But it's also got to do with, conceptually, it's got to do with this feeling that diabetes really is about relationality. I mean, it's really a disease where relationships are key, both to humans and non-humans. I mean, relationships with technologies and devices, but relationships with other people. And the way that sort of, I mean, in the context of this project, it's about the circulation of data, and the way that data and its circulation and what we do with it produces certain kinds of relationships in the world. And so what are the kinds of relationships that we're interested in exploring and fostering through that data? And are there some opportunities that go beyond sort of, what I think is often very judgment based in terms of the data, like kind of using it to legitimate a claim, or kind of always using it at least in the context of, so what, kind of evaluating how you've performed in the past, what you should do now, what your future outcome might be. So to move a little bit away from that and think about in a way that's starting to be a bit more thinking together, hopefully, through the collaboration. But,
yeah, that's interesting. And I very much appreciate this kind of complex way of engaging that problem of relationships are central to what it means to live with and treat diabetes. That as a kind of core driving piece of this conversation is really fascinating. So, Sam, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm very much looking forward to these next couple of projects as they come together.
Oh, thanks so much, Stephen. Yeah, it's been great to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Absolutely. Thanks. All right. So Sam is an interesting guy.
Yeah, I loved this interview. I loved, he's an artist, so of course I'm drawn to that.
Yeah,
but
totally.
There were some really great topics of conversation.
Yeah, I obviously, when I go into these interviews, I obviously have some idea of the direction that we'll generally go, but I'm always, every time I do one of these, I'm always kind of surprised throughout these interviews every time, right? We get into conversation, things open up, they go in all of these directions that obviously I can't plan for, or plan for. It's not like these are scripted.
Right.
It's also not like we set up a strict outline for discussion either.
Sure.
But between us. And so it opens up. And some of the ways that he was talking about sound and diabetes was really fascinating. And we've started delving into some of that in other conversations.
Yeah, and I think what's most interesting about it is there's of course the sounds that are like obvious.
Right.
Like obvious diabetic sounds, like the clicking of your blood tester and like your pump or things. And it was interesting because he was talking about the sounds outside of what we've usually talked about with like beeping alarms and like
Right.
technology kind of centered things, but the more kind of basic things that you probably overlook a lot of the time because they're just like normal to
Just
you.
part of
You know,
life,
you test your blood a million times, or you
Right.
roll an insulin bottle, or there's just lots of different things that are common, as with anything in your
Yeah.
life. That it's not like you think of like all the sounds that you make every day when you're brushing your teeth, or
Right.
those things that you do every day.
And all the little things that aren't directly part of, for example, the brushing, right? If this was like our example of brushing
Yeah.
your teeth, there's all these little things there that aren't the brushing action. Obviously, you've got the like, that's the central kind of
Yeah.
sound of brushing. But what about the very slight kind of clink sound when your toothbrush touches the cup? Or, your sink will have a very particular kind of sound made not only by the little handles or knobs, but the way the water happens to hit in the basin, what the basin's made of. All these little things change all of the soundscape of brushing your teeth, right? And the same would be the case with diabetes. So let me ask you, are there any parts of the diabetic soundscape that, as we've kind of listened back through this interview with Sam and we have started talking into some of these things, are there any parts of the diabetic soundscape that are maybe not always front and center and that we haven't necessarily talked about a lot?
I don't know. I mean, that's a great question, obviously. I would have to think about.
And I sprung this on you. So
I know.
I don't want to
Putting me on the
put you on the
spot.
spot, but putting you on the spot helps.
I'm trying to think of, I don't know, things that like are happening while you're doing these things. I don't know. I mean, the
One thing that came to my mind just now as you were talking is like the sound of the sound that you make when you pull the straw off the back of a juicy juice box, right? So you've got that little bit of the crinkly like cellophane plastic around the straw, but the way that the glue disconnects from the box itself, right? That little sound there is just part of the process, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of treating a low, which is part of living with diet, right?
Yeah, that's probably the most common. I don't know. I guess what my mind initially went to was the cat bag. I have this bag with cats on it. It's like a little zip pouch that I keep all my insulin pump extras and things in. And so like the sound of the bag, like as you pick it up, has this very distinct sound when you pick it up because it has all this stuff in it, like all these contraptions, all these loose things in there that like I don't want to lose. So that's kind of what my mind went
That's
to.
a good one.
But
That's a good one. And its particular zipper is a unique sound compared to any other zippers involved. We've already talked about the sound of the zipper of the blood tester a little bit in a previous episode, I think, when we were talking about some of those unexpected ways that your devices are present, right? But yeah, so you've got the zipper on there. You've got the kind of that. It's like a dampened rattle thing in the bag, right?
yeah.
But part of what's so interesting there, right, is he was talking about how every time he was going to test his blood, he was recording it as part of this particular project. And one of the things that I am just fascinated about is the way that he is thinking about how all of this is taking place in context, right? There are other things going on around us. It's part of everyday life. It's all these things. And so capturing the sound of the actions alongside all of that context, right? The ambient sounds, maybe the sound of the dog behind us as she creeps into our recordings every once in a while. Or, we don't live on a super busy street, but busy enough. And so there's cars going past and all kinds of other little things. The sound of the heater or AC blowing through the vents and all these little things that are part of the experience, right? Even though they're not the action.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting in an art sense, and especially when he was talking about accessibility and experience, that, for people who are deaf, maybe don't experience all of those sounds that kind of are attributed to a lot of these things. And so how he has sort of thought through different ways of, showing his art and creating these experiences of touch and sound and feel and visuals, so that there's like different ways that you're experiencing all of these things.
Yeah, because, there are deaf and or blind diabetics.
Yeah.
Right? They experience these things, right? And so their soundscape may be experienced differently, but that's part of the point.
Yeah.
Right? And so, and this gets at some of that work that he does with vibration and the focus on vibration in producing various forms of art because of the way that sound is vibration.
Yeah.
And so soundscapes matter in the context of deaf diabetic experience, right? Because those vibrations are present. They're just present differently for their experience.
Right.
Right. And the way that this, of course, it was being conceptualized within the context of a show that was devoted to building out artistic production and curating that work with accessibility as the foundational piece.
Yeah, and how he mentioned that it wasn't just making it accessible after you've already like made the thing, right?
Tack it on.
It's like making it accessible as you're thinking of the project in its, beginning phases, so that the way you're creating it has all of these things in mind. I think that's a really great way to be creating anything, right? Creating art, creating experiences, thinking about different ways and different, formats to experience things.
Yeah, and the way we build out our world.
Yeah.
Right? This mirrors a lot of this language around universal design in the context of architecture and disability, because this is an artistic kind of space or expression of a large-scale social institutional problem, which is the world is built for able-bodied and able-minded people.
Yeah.
And accessibility is usually conceptualized as the thing that you add to the already existing project or thing that you are building out in the world so that, quote unquote, they can access it too. But the point is that already assumes that they are not part of why you're doing what you're doing.
Right.
And that's a real problem. And so this universal design approach to art production and curation is fascinating and really important. That project was happening for him at the same time that he was talking about this Fitbit project as well, right? Where he was working with another person and collaborating, using their Fitbit data to produce sonifications or sonifying those numbers to produce visual or material kind of art productions. And that's what got him into then the space of using it for in the context of his diabetes. And I think the big piece there that I think is probably the biggest takeaway of this conversation for me was the way that he's talking through how and why he's choosing to use the data at all in his work. Yes, his art, but also his research,
Right.
potentially the way that it makes its way into the classroom we didn't talk about, but that I could see that being a thing as well, is all about trying to re-envision how we can understand the data and what it is and why we engage with it.
Yeah. It's so fascinating because we've talked a little bit about, feelings associated with numbers, right?
Yeah.
High blood sugars, low blood sugars, whatever the numbers are, right? And I loved when he was talking about sort of reimagining how those numbers are interpreted by us and reimagining how we think about those numbers. And he kind of touched on kind of his concern with his latest project in getting people to participate because those numbers are, private, or, people are insecure about sharing those numbers, or, those things. And why are those feelings created? Like, why are we having those feelings? And I think that's really, a huge part of being someone with diabetes, right? Is how you feel about these arbitrary numbers, right? And they've become not arbitrary because they mean something, right? You test and you're low, and that creates feelings, right? Panic or stress or anxiety
or shame
or worry
or guilt.
Or
right.
With high numbers especially, is a lot of that shame and guilt and, feeling like you're not good enough or feeling like you're not taking care of yourself, or all these like associated feelings with these numbers, right? It's sort of hard to wrap your head around when you kind of talk about it. You can talk yourself in circles, but
for sure. And the part of this that's so hard to kind of unravel and understanding how this is all made and created and in experiences is that we're talking about emotion related feeling and we're talking about physiological feeling, sensing, right? Sensory experience of your own body at the same time.
Yeah.
And so these emotional responses are tied to social definitions of these numbers and what they mean. Meaning is created. Meaning is human.
Sure.
Right? Regardless of what is happening biologically with your body that's producing the human-made numbers that code this human-made meaning, etc., right? But the point is that we then have these emotions tied to what it actually physically feels like to be high or what it physically feels like to be low.
Sure.
Those map together. And so unraveling what feeling is associated with, let's say, a 250 blood glucose reading, right? Or 300 blood glucose reading. Feeling is way more complicated than even the super complicated emotion tied to those.
Right. And how your body sort of reacts to those feelings. And I think when you're low, your body has this automatic like stress trigger because it's trying to tell you, right?
Like, hey, I need to stay alive.
Hey, like I'm panicking because your body's going to stop functioning. Right. And I think with high blood sugars, it's a lot more complicated because it's not as immediate. Those feelings aren't, the consequences of high blood sugars aren't always as immediate, right?
Right.
And if you're feeling those high blood sugars a lot, you may not even notice. I think we kind of talked about in an early episode when, high blood sugars were kind of your normal, right? Because
I think we were talking about this with Josh Iddings.
Yeah, because of his misdiagnosis, and he didn't even really notice how bad he was feeling until, he was diagnosed and then having like proper treatment for those numbers. And I felt that a lot, when you're trying to lower your blood sugars, like when I was pregnant and you're trying to keep your blood sugars at this really low,
like
constant
shockingly
state.
low, constant.
It was like really hard because
It's
you're
like 75 or 80
tired
all the time.
and
Yeah,
your body is
75.
like not, when you're usually like treating something that low,
Mhm.
it's like this roller coaster
You
of,
just sit there,
oh
right?
my gosh.
Man, I remember it was brutal.
Yeah, it was
And-
hard to function.
And again, right, that the physiological feeling is then mapped onto the emotional feeling and those judgment calls, right? Because he was talking about essentially the value that we place on the numbers
Mm-hmm.
because they are positive or they are negative,
Right.
right? And that binary thinking about the numbers is really problematic.
Yeah.
Right? It creates the necessity of judgment based on value, right?
Well, and when you map that good, bad onto yourself as good or bad, like you could have this bad number, but then are you
Mm-hmm.
putting that, like mapping that onto you as a person? Like I'm bad because this number is bad, right?
Right, right. Because as we've talked about in other episodes, diabetes is part of one's identity,
Mm-hmm.
right? It is, as much as we may or may not want to claim it as a central part of our identity, it still does influence that.
Yeah.
And so when you map those judgment-based readings of the numbers onto, like you said, your selfhood, your actual person, then we get into these even kind of deeper spirals that can result from this. And so his notion that maybe there are ways that we can start to think about and engage with these numbers outside the context of biomedicine and treatment, where they live, because that's their purpose. That's where they
Right.
were created. That's where they're used. But if we can start to engage them outside of that context, in his claim, through art, it provides a way for us to recode what kinds of feelings and experiences we are associating with the numbers themselves. That's huge,
Yeah.
right? That's a big project, obviously, right? And this is
Right.
the theory, this is the basis of the work. And even though we didn't necessarily get there, I'm sure if we were to talk through this, he would probably be able to identify and talk through ways that it has worked and ways that it has missed as well.
Sure.
And that's part of the importance of artistic production in general, though, right?
Right. I mean, obviously not all projects go the way you think they are, but that is sometimes what creates the most interesting, outcomes. I think he kind of mentioned how he wasn't anticipating how some of his test strip project was,
Right.
creating different visuals and things. I think, was that what he said?
Probably.
I'm trying to remember the part.
I'm in the depths of our conversation now, so I can't remember. But I know that part, though, that you're referring to, where he was essentially creating vibration from the numbers and then using that vibration to animate the test strips. And it was doing really interesting, remarkable things as he was filming it happen, right? And again, that's that surprising process of artistic production that sometimes stuff comes out that you didn't know could or would.
Yeah, I think most of the time you have sort of that aha moment in projects where it's like either, wow, this is amazing, or like, oh crap, this isn't what I expected. But, that's part of learning and creating, right?
Yeah, totally.
Experimentation.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's happened with our show even,
Yeah.
right? There are a number of things that we've done, ways that we've approached conversations, introduced people or introduced breads or whatever, the topics or whatever. Some have worked well and like little things came out that were surprising. In other cases, it's like, I probably would do this a little different next time, right? But that's part of the process. And I think the goal of creating all of that as an immersive experience ties into a lot of this larger notion then that he was getting at of, you know what? Living with diabetes is an immersive experience.
Yeah.
Right? It involves every one of your senses in different and complicated ways. And the context matters.
Yeah.
Right? And so this point that he was making, and I love this because I do work on kind of complicating our understandings of data. And so this makes sense. But the notion of bringing the context back into the data is amazing. That notion is fantastic because the whole point, part of the problem that I've identified in some of my work too with the production of these numbers is that they are totally extracted from the context. The context of your body, the context of
your experience,
experiences,
or what you're living through in that moment.
Absolutely. They are extracted. There is no context to the numbers that come out. And so we have to bring the context back.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I just had a doctor's appointment, and when you talk about, because they read obviously these graphs of numbers that you have from your insulin pump, and then being asked, oh, do you remember what happened like on this Wednesday when you had this high blood sugar? And it's like,
that was 3 weeks ago. What?
No, you know what I mean? Like, and that's every time there's this question like, oh, well, what happened? Like, you know, was this something that is a usual thing, or was this some outlier? Like, oh, you had this high blood sugar. Like, what happened here? And I'm thinking, I cannot tell you.
No idea.
Like, what did you have? You know, what did you breathe? Like, what? It's like I was trying to think of something to compare it to like ask somebody, like, because it's not even like, it's even more complicated than asking like, what did you eat on this day? Because you could like attribute that to like what you're doing, right? But like, what happened with this high blood sugar? Well, like, I don't even know.
Right.
Because like, how am I supposed to remember? You have every day you have
It's
this
24/7.
context for what's happening, right?
And it's
so
nonstop.
being asked to remember what happened on Wednesday last week when you had this blood sugar, it's like, like racking your brain. You're like,
I can barely remember yesterday. Thank you very much.
and obviously some of those are like outliers. And so maybe you do remember it happening, but you don't remember like, oh, well, I ate this, and this, and then this, you know?
Yeah.
And maybe
totally.
that's just me. I think a lot of times I'm like, there's too much of this in my head and I have to just let go of it, right? Like we talk about this a lot. Sometimes I test my blood, and if it's within like a good range, I will not remember that number seconds after.
Yeah.
Like, see, will
Right.
like, oh, what were you? And I'm like, I
don't
literally don't remember, but it's
Means it must have
probably
been
okay.
fine.
And then I'll look
Yeah.
at it, it's like 101. And it's like, yep, there was nothing in, like, no reason to keep that data in my head.
Right. Right.
So,
And even in talking through this, right? Even as you're talking through this, you're using that language that's coding the numbers positive,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
Because it was a good number, is what you said, right?
Yeah.
And so it's baked into the very notion of how we treat and understand what diabetes is.
Yeah.
And if we are going to, critically engage all of this stuff in ways that can be productive and more helpful for people.
And like realistic, honestly.
And realistic,
right?
yeah,
Because
totally.
that is how you have to like navigate your life, right? You have
Right.
to. And so I love how he's rethinking ways to talk about the data and ways to think about it, because maybe that can kind of reassign how we're talking about our diabetes or thinking about it, because we can talk all day about don't call them bad and good numbers, but like internally,
That's not enough, right?
like
Yeah.
it's not
Because then
going
you
to
just
change
get rid
anything.
of those words.
Yeah.
But the very structure for how these numbers are created, why we're using and looking at them,
Mm-hmm.
and then how we apply them and in what context, all of that's still there if you
Right.
don't use the positive, negative, good, bad language.
Yeah,
right?
and you're still assigning how you feel to those numbers,
Right.
right? So you feel good when you're this number. You feel bad when you're this number. So there's so many complicated layers within those labelings, right?
Totally. And this, at its core, I think some of these are opened up. I don't want to say explained by, but at least informed by this other kind of major component of a lot of the way he's thinking through his work, and that is the notion that diabetes is fundamentally relational.
Yeah.
Right. And so oftentimes you think about a particular chronic illness or disability as inherently internal and individual.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is, it can't be.
Yeah.
Period. Diabetes cannot be understood that way.
Right.
Because it requires insulin injection.
Right.
To live and survive, period. So that is a relationship between humans, bodies, and technologies at its very core kind of level. And so this whole notion that, well, then we need to start thinking about all of these relationships a little bit more, right? And critically about how those relationships are built and how we're using them.
Thanks for listening and coming along with us on this episode. We're very grateful to Sam for being with us today and helping us engage this conversation.
Yeah, huge thank you again, Dr. Samuel Thulin. As usual, go ahead and like and subscribe wherever it is that you're listening. Head over to Diabreadic.com for more on the breads and the conversations around the way that we are complicating understandings of chronic illness.